The Eagle of France rose from the ashes of revolution to cast its shadow across the entire continent of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the rugged island of Corsica, where the scent of wild thyme filled the hot summer air. He entered the world in Ajaccio merely months after the French had purchased the island from the Republic of Genoa. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer who quickly adapted to French rule to secure a future for his large family. Letizia, his mother, was a woman of iron will who instilled a sense of destiny in her second surviving son. The boy grew up surrounded by the rough beauty of the Mediterranean and the constant talk of island politics. He was a turbulent child who dominated his elder brother Joseph and led the local children in mock battles. His father secured a scholarship for him at the military academy at Brienne in northern France. At the age of 9, Napoleon left his homeland for a country where he barely spoke the language. He arrived at the school in winter, where the gray skies contrasted sharply with the warm sun of Corsica. His fellow students were sons of rich aristocrats who mocked his accent and his relative poverty. Napoleon withdrew into himself and found solace in books about history and great military conquerors. He excelled in mathematics and geography, while nurturing a deep resentment for the French aristocracy. During the snowy winters, he organized his classmates into armies and commanded snowball fights with tactical precision. He remained at Brienne for 5 years without once returning home to see his family. His academic success earned him a place at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. He arrived in the capital as a young man of 16, determined to master the art of artillery. The school was a marvel of architecture and discipline where the future officers of the king were trained. He completed the rigorous 2-year course in a single year through sheer determination and intellect. Napoleon was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Lafare Artillery Regiment. He wore his uniform with pride, but his heart remained with the independence movement in Corsica. The garrison life was dull, so he spent his meager salary on books and read voraciously. He studied the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar and analyzed the topography of potential battlefields. The French Revolution erupted in 1789 and shattered the old order of the monarchy and the church. Napoleon welcomed the change as an opportunity for merit to replace privilege in the army ranks. He took leave to return to Corsica and immersed himself in the complex local politics of the island. He attempted to lead the National Guard, but found himself at odds with the patriot leader Pasquale Paoli. The conflict between the royalists and revolutionaries on the island turned violent and dangerous for his family. Paoli denounced the Bonapartes as collaborators with France and forced them to flee for their lives. Napoleon landed in France with his widowed mother and siblings as destitute political refugees. The family settled in Marseille and lived in poverty while the terror gripped the nation. Napoleon returned to his regiment and looked for a chance to prove his worth to the Republic. The port city of Toulon had rebelled against the convention and opened its harbor to the British fleet. Republican forces laid siege to the city, but their initial efforts were disorganized and ineffective. Napoleon was appointed commander of the artillery through the influence of political allies. He arrived at Toulon and immediately saw that the key to the city lay in the heights above the harbor. He worked tirelessly to gather cannons and train infantrymen to serve as gunners. He slept on the ground beside his guns and earned the respect of the hardened soldiers. His plan was simple, yet brilliant, as he focused fire on the ships to force a British withdrawal. He led the final assault on Fort Mulgrave himself and received a bayonet wound in the thigh. The British fleet retreated in panic, and the city of Toulon fell back into French hands. His name appeared in the dispatches, and he was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. He had saved the Republic in the south, but politics in Paris were shifting like sand. The fall of Robespierre left Napoleon under suspicion, and he was briefly imprisoned at Fort Car. He was released, but found himself without a command and wandered the streets of Paris in despair. He considered offering his services to the Sultan of Turkey, as his career in France seemed over. Destiny intervened when a royalist uprising threatened the National Convention in October 1795. Paul Barras remembered the young officer from Toulon and called upon him to defend the government. Napoleon accepted the command and ordered cannons to be brought into the center of Paris. He placed his guns strategically around the Tuileries Palace to create a kill zone. The royalist mob advanced through the narrow streets, expecting the soldiers to hold their fire. Napoleon gave the order, and the cannons unleashed a whiff of grape shot into the packed crowd. The royalist insurrection was crushed in minutes, and the Republic was saved once again. He became the hero of the hour and was named commander of the Army of the Interior. He was introduced to the high society of Paris and the salons of the new elite. There he met Rose de Beauharnais, a widow with 2 children, and a seductive charm. He was captivated by her grace, and she saw in him a protector for her uncertain future. He renamed her Josephine and poured out his passion in letters that she barely understood. They were married in a civil ceremony just days before he left for the front. He had been given command of the Army of Italy, which was a ragtag force of starving soldiers. He arrived in Nice to find his troops without shoes and demoralized by months of neglect. The older generals looked at this small and scrawny commander with skepticism and doubt. Napoleon addressed the troops and promised them honor and glory and riches beyond their wildest dreams. He did not wait for supplies, but launched a lightning offensive across the mountains. He struck at the point where the Austrian and Sardinian armies were linked. He moved his divisions with a speed that baffled the enemy commanders who were used to slow warfare. In a series of rapid battles, he separated his foes and defeated them one by one. The road to Milan lay open, and the Austrians retreated in confusion. He led a charge across the bridge at Lodi and cemented his legend among his men. The soldiers nicknamed him the Little Corporal for his courage under fire. He entered Milan as a liberator and established a new republic based on French ideals. He sent wagons filled with art and gold back to Paris to stabilize the economy. Josephine remained in Paris, and his letters to her became increasingly desperate and jealous. He pushed the Austrians back to Mantua and laid siege to the fortress city. 4 Austrian armies were sent to relieve the city, but Napoleon defeated each one in turn. The Battle of Arcole saw him seize a flag and lead a charge into a hail of bullets. He fell into the marsh and was nearly captured, but his men rallied to save him. The final Austrian attempt to break the siege was crushed at the Battle of Rivoli. Mantua surrendered, and the Austrian emperor was forced to sue for peace. Napoleon negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio and redrew the map of Italy without consulting Paris. He returned to France as the most famous man in Europe and a threat to the Directory. The government wanted him away from Paris, so they approved his plan to invade Egypt. He dreamed of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great and striking at British India. He gathered a fleet and an army, along with a legion of scientists and artists. They evaded the British Navy in the Mediterranean and landed near Alexandria in July 1798. The Mamluk warriors rode out to meet the French in the desert heat. Napoleon formed his infantry into squares to repel the charges of the magnificent cavalry. The Battle of the Pyramids was a slaughter where modern discipline triumphed over medieval valor. He entered Cairo as the master of Egypt and set about reforming the administration. His scientists studied the ancient ruins and discovered the Rosetta Stone, which unlocked the hieroglyphs. But disaster struck at sea when Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet at Aboukir Bay. The army was trapped in Egypt with no way to return to France. Napoleon remained undaunted and marched into Syria to preempt a Turkish attack. He captured Jaffa, but the siege of Acre stalled against stout resistance and British naval guns. Plague broke out in the camp, and he was forced to order a difficult retreat back to Egypt. He defeated a Turkish army that landed at Aboukir. But the news from France was grim. Italy had been lost, and the Directory was crumbling under corruption and incompetence. He made a bold decision to abandon his army in Egypt and return to Paris to save the nation. He slipped past the British blockade and landed in France to a rapturous welcome. The people saw him as the sword that would restore order and victory to the Republic. He conspired with Talleyrand and his brother Lucien to overthrow the government. The coup of 18 Brumaire began with a legislative maneuver to move the councils to St. Cloud. Napoleon addressed the deputies, but was met with shouts of outlaw and tyrant. He was physically jostled and nearly fainted in the chaos of the council chamber. Lucien saved the day by ordering the grenadiers to clear the hall of the dissenting politicians. The Directory was dissolved, and a consulate was established with Napoleon as first consul. He was 30 years old and effectively the dictator of France. He worked 18 hours a day to reorganize the laws and the economy of the nation. He created the Bank of France to stabilize the currency and end inflation. He signed the Concordat with the Pope and restored the Catholic Church to French life. But the war continued, and he needed one more victory to secure his power. He led an army over the snowy Great St. Bernard Pass in a feat that rivaled Hannibal. He descended into Italy and surprised the Austrians who thought he was still in Paris. The Battle of Marengo was nearly lost until Desailles arrived with reinforcements to turn the tide. The victory secured his position and allowed him to dictate peace to the continent. He was named consul for life and began to act more like a monarch than a republican. He codified the laws into the Napoleonic Code, which guaranteed equality before the law. Plots against his life by royalists and Jacobins made him paranoid about his succession. He decided that the only way to secure the regime was to establish a hereditary dynasty. The Senate proclaimed him Emperor of the French in May 1804. He invited the Pope to Paris to consecrate the coronation at Notre Dame Cathedral. Napoleon took the crown from the hands of the Pope and placed it on his own head. He then crowned Josephine as Empress while the congregation watched in awe. The Republic was dead and the Empire had begun, with all the trappings of royalty. Britain declared war again and formed a new coalition with Austria and Russia. Napoleon gathered the Grand Army at Boulogne and prepared to invade England across the Channel. He trained his men relentlessly until they were the finest fighting force in the world. But the French Navy was defeated by Nelson at Trafalgar, ending all hope of invasion. Napoleon turned his army east and marched them with incredible speed toward the Austrian border. He surrounded the Austrian army at Ulm and forced their surrender without a major battle. He captured Vienna and moved north to face the combined Russian and Austrian emperors. The Battle of Austerlitz was his masterpiece, where he lured the enemy into a trap. He weakened his right flank to tempt the Russians to attack and abandon the high ground. The sun rose on the frozen plateau as the French troops waited in the mist. When the enemy was committed, he launched his main strike force at the Pratzen Heights. The French split the Allied center and crushed the enemy armies in detail. It was the anniversary of his coronation and his greatest military triumph. Austria sued for peace, and the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved after 1,000 years. Prussia watched with alarm and foolishly declared war on France the following year. Napoleon moved faster than the Prussians could mobilize and invaded their territory. He destroyed the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. He entered Berlin in triumph and visited the tomb of Frederick the Great. He stripped the Prussian state of its lands and imposed heavy indemnities. The Russians remained in the field, and he pursued them into the freezing mud of Poland. The Battle of Eylau was a bloody draw fought in a blinding snowstorm. Both sides suffered massive casualties, and the carnage shocked even the hardened emperor. He regrouped and finally defeated the Russians decisively at the Battle of Friedland. Tsar Alexander met Napoleon on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River to negotiate peace. They divided Europe between them and excluded British goods from the continent. This continental system was designed to strangle the British economy through a blockade. Napoleon was now the master of Europe and placed his brothers on the thrones of nations. He sent troops into Spain to enforce the blockade and replace the Spanish king with his brother Joseph. The Spanish people rose up in a savage guerrilla war that drained French resources. The British landed an army in Portugal to support the Spanish resistance. Austria saw the French distraction in Spain as a chance to seek revenge. They invaded Bavaria, but Napoleon rushed back from Spain to confront them. The campaign was difficult and culminated in the massive Battle of Wagram. The Austrians fought with new determination, but were ultimately defeated again. Napoleon imposed a harsh peace and demanded a royal bride to secure his dynasty. He divorced Josephine because she could not provide him with an heir. It was a personal tragedy for both, but he placed the state above his heart. He married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, who was the niece of Marie Antoinette. She bore him a son who was given the title King of Rome. The empire was at its zenith, but cracks were appearing in the foundation. The continental system was ruining the economies of Europe and breeding resentment. Tsar Alexander refused to enforce the blockade and opened Russian ports to British trade. Napoleon felt he had no choice but to force the Russians back into line. He assembled the largest army in history with over 600,000 men. The Grand Army crossed the Niemen River in June 1812 to invade Russia. The Russians retreated and burned the land to deny supplies to the invaders. Napoleon sought a decisive battle, but the enemy slipped away into the vast interior. The summer heat and disease decimated the French ranks before they even fought. The Battle of Borodino was a brutal slugging match outside the gates of Moscow. Napoleon won the field, but the Russian army remained intact and withdrew. He entered Moscow expecting the Tsar to sue for peace and end the war. But the city was deserted, and soon flames engulfed the wooden buildings. He waited in the ruins for weeks while the first snows of winter began to fall. He finally ordered the retreat, but it was too late to escape the Russian winter. The march back was a nightmare of freezing cold and starvation and Cossack attacks. The Grand Army disintegrated as men froze to death by the thousands on the road. They crossed the Berezina River under fire in a scene of utter horror. Napoleon left his shattered army and raced back to Paris to suppress a coup attempt. He raised a new army of young conscripts to defend the borders of the empire. The nations of Europe saw the lion was wounded and formed a massive coalition. He fought a brilliant defensive campaign in Germany, but was outnumbered. The Battle of Leipzig was the battle of nations where he was defeated by overwhelming odds. He retreated to France and fought a series of tactical masterpieces to defend Paris. But his marshals were tired of war, and the people were exhausted. The Allies entered Paris, and his generals refused to march on the capital. Napoleon abdicated the throne and attempted to take his own life with poison. He survived and was exiled to the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean. He retained the title of emperor and was given sovereignty over the island. He improved the infrastructure of Elba, but his restless spirit could not be contained. He watched as the Allies squabbled in Vienna, and the French king Louis XVIII became unpopular. He escaped from Elba with 1,000 men and landed in the south of France. The royalist troops sent to intercept him defected and joined his ranks. He marched to Paris gathering support without firing a single shot. The king fled and Napoleon reclaimed the throne for the 100 Days. The Allies immediately declared him an outlaw and mobilized their armies. He decided to strike first before they could unite their forces against him. He marched into Belgium to separate the British and Prussian armies. He defeated the Prussians at Ligny, but they were not destroyed. 2 days later, he faced the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo on muddy ground. He waited for the ground to dry, which gave the Prussians time to arrive. The French cavalry charged the British squares in vain as the afternoon wore on. The arrival of the Prussians on his flank sealed his doom, and the army routed. He abdicated for the second time and surrendered to the British Navy. They exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. He lived in a damp house called Longwood, surrounded by British guards. He spent his final years dictating his memoirs and fighting petty battles with the governor. His health declined rapidly, and he suffered from stomach pain and weakness. Napoleon Bonaparte died on May 5, 1821, during a raging storm. His last words were France the army, head of the army Josephine. The news of his death traveled slowly across the ocean to a Europe that had moved on. The monarchs of the Holy Alliance breathed a sigh of relief that the disturber of the peace was gone. But from the grave, Napoleon began his final and most successful campaign, which was the conquest of memory. The publication of his memoirs from St. Helena painted him not as a tyrant, but as a martyr for liberty. The Romantic generation of poets and artists embraced his legend as a symbol of individual genius against the world. His image was reproduced in millions of prints and busts that found their way into cottages across France. The soldiers of the Grand Army, who were now aging veterans, kept his memory alive in village taverns. They told stories of the little corporal who had shared their hardships and led them to glory. The Bourbon monarchy tried to suppress the memory of the empire, but the legend was too strong to bury. In 1840, King Louis Philippe decided to bring the emperor's remains back to France to bolster his own popularity. The expedition to St. Helena was led by the Prince de Joinville and included surviving members of the imperial household. They opened the coffin on the lonely island and found the body of Napoleon miraculously preserved. He was dressed in his green uniform of the Chasseurs of the Guard with the Legion of Honor on his breast. The return of the ashes was a moment of intense national emotion that united the French people. The ships sailed up the Seine River in December, amidst freezing temperatures and snow flurries. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the riverbanks in silence to watch the funeral barge pass by. The procession through Paris was a spectacle of imperial grandeur that recalled the days of victory. Old soldiers in their faded uniforms wept openly as the hearse passed beneath the Arc de Triomphe. He was laid to rest in the Invalides under the great golden dome that dominates the skyline of Paris. The tomb of red porphyry became a pilgrimage site for admirers of military genius from around the world. But the legacy of Napoleon went far beyond the legend of battles and the pomp of funerals. His true monument was the administrative and legal structure that he had built for France. The Napoleonic Code remained the basis of French law and influenced legal systems across Europe and Latin America. He had created the lycées, which formed the backbone of the French education system for 2 centuries. The Bank of France and the system of prefects were enduring institutions that survived every regime change. He had modernized Paris with new bridges and canals and monuments that celebrated French achievements. He had awakened the spirit of nationalism in Italy and Germany, which would eventually lead to their unification. The map of Europe had been redrawn by his sword and could never completely return to the old order. Military academies studied his campaigns as the perfect examples of strategy and maneuver and logistics. He taught the world the value of speed and the importance of concentrating force at the decisive point. His use of artillery changed warfare forever and paved the way for the modern age of conflict. Yet his ambition had come at a terrible cost in human life and suffering across the continent. Millions had died in the wars that bore his name, and entire regions had been devastated by the fighting. He had sacrificed the liberty of the revolution for the efficiency and order of a military dictatorship. The censorship of the press and the secret police were the darker instruments of his imperial rule. He had re-established slavery in the colonies, which remains a stain on his record as a reformer. The duality of his character continues to divide historians and fascinate the public 2 centuries later. He was a man of the Enlightenment who believed in reason and progress and the power of the intellect. Yet he was also a man of destiny who believed in his star and the role of fate. He was a loving father and a generous friend, but he could be cold and calculating when necessary. His relationship with Josephine remains one of the great tragic love stories of history. He never stopped loving her even after the divorce, and she remained in his heart until the end. Her name was on his lips as he lay dying on the rock of St. Helena. The letters they exchanged reveal a passion that was as volatile and intense as the era they lived in. The story of Napoleon is the story of human potential pushed to its absolute limits. It is a reminder that a single individual can shape the course of history through will and talent. He rose from obscurity to become the master of kings and the arbiter of nations. He fell from the greatest heights to the lowest depths of exile and imprisonment. His life encompasses the full spectrum of human experience, from triumph to tragedy and glory to despair. The eagle had flown higher than any other before falling back to the earth. The sun of Austerlitz had set, but the twilight of the legend would last forever. The shadow of the emperor still looms over France and the history of the modern world. His story is a tragedy in the classical sense, where the flaws of the hero lead to his destruction. His hubris in invading Russia and his refusal to make peace when he could were his undoing. But without that limitless ambition, he would never have achieved what he did. The paradox of Napoleon is that he was both the product of the revolution and its gravedigger. He saved the revolution from its enemies, but he ended its democratic experiment. He spread the ideals of liberty and equality, but he ruled as an autocrat. He freed the Jews from the ghettos of Europe, but he imposed strict control over society. He was a complex figure who cannot be easily categorized as a hero or a villain. He was simply Napoleon, and there has never been another like him in history. The world he left behind was fundamentally different from the one he had entered. The feudal system was dead, and the age of meritocracy had begun in earnest. The rights of property and the equality of citizens were established principles that could not be erased. The grandeur of his vision continues to inspire and to warn us of the dangers of power. As we look back on his life, we see a reflection of our own aspirations and failures. The story of the Corsican boy who became the emperor of the French is the ultimate human drama. It is a story of courage and intellect and the relentless pursuit of glory. It is a story that will be told and retold as long as history is written. The echoes of his cannons have faded, but the voice of his destiny still speaks to us. The wind still blows over the rugged coast of Corsica where it all began. The Seine still flows past the Invalides where the emperor sleeps his eternal sleep. The history of Napoleon Bonaparte is the history of a world in transition. It is the bridge between the old Europe of kings and the new Europe of nations. It is a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome impossible odds. It is a warning that even the greatest power is fleeting and that all empires must fall. But in the end, the legend remains, and the eagle still soars in the imagination. The life of Napoleon Bonaparte stands as a monument to the extraordinary possibilities of a single life. But to truly know the emperor, we must look beyond the marble statues and return to the blood and mud of the battlefield. The genius of Napoleon was not just in his grand strategy, but in his obsession with the smallest details of war. He knew the walking speed of a regiment and the weight of a knapsack and the firing rate of a cannon. He could glance at a map and instantly visualize the terrain as if he were standing upon the hills. Before the Battle of Austerlitz, he spent days studying the ground until every ravine and stream was etched in his mind. He walked among the campfires on the eve of battle and spoke to the soldiers in their own rough dialect. They cheered him and lit torches of straw to guide his way in a spontaneous display of devotion. He told them exactly how the battle would unfold and where they would strike the decisive blow. When the fog lifted on that cold December morning, he watched from his command post with absolute calm. He waited for the Russians to empty the center of their line before unleashing the corps of Marshal Soult. The French infantry climbed the slopes of the Pratzen Heights in silence, with bayonets fixed and ready. The shock of their arrival broke the Allied line and sent the Russian Imperial Guard reeling back in confusion. Napoleon directed the artillery fire himself and turned the frozen lakes into a watery grave for the retreating enemy. It was a victory of the mind as much as the sword, and it left Europe stunned by his brilliance. Yet the man who conquered empires was also a man who was deeply superstitious and looked for omens. He believed in his star and would often search the night sky for the guiding light of his destiny. He was terrified of black cats and would not begin a journey on a Friday if it could be avoided. He carried a miniature portrait of Josephine in his pocket during every campaign and kissed it before battle. His letters to her from the front lines of Italy are some of the most passionate ever written. He chided her for not writing enough and accused her of loving her dogs more than she loved him. He was a man of intense jealousy who could not bear the thought of her smiling at another man. When he discovered her affairs while he was in Egypt, his heart was broken and he became cynical about love. He took mistresses of his own, but none of them ever held the same power over him as the Creole beauty. The intricate dance of his court was a battlefield of a different kind, where words were the weapons. Talleyrand, the limping foreign minister, was the only man who could match the emperor in wit and guile. They played a dangerous game of cat and mouse where the fate of nations hung on a whispered phrase. Napoleon knew that Talleyrand was treacherous, but he needed his diplomatic skills to manage the conquered lands. The emperor created a new aristocracy based on service to the state rather than ancient bloodlines. He made the sons of innkeepers into dukes and the sons of coopers into marshals of the empire. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, was a cooper's son who rose to command the rear guard in Russia. Marshal Murat, the flamboyant cavalry commander, was the son of an innkeeper who became a king. These men loved Napoleon because he made them see that anything was possible if one had the courage to seize it. The emperor demanded everything from his subordinates and could be a harsh and unforgiving taskmaster. He would dictate to 4 secretaries at once and expected them to keep up with his racing thoughts. He slept only 4 hours a night and would wake up at dawn to read reports and issue orders. He controlled the press and the theaters, and even the style of furniture that was fashionable in Paris. The Empire style was designed to project part and permanence with its heavy mahogany and gold ornaments. He wanted Paris to be the new Rome and ordered the construction of monuments that would last for millennia. The Arc de Triomphe was commissioned to honor the Grand Army, but he never saw it completed in his lifetime. He built the Rue de Rivoli and the Madeleine Church and the Bourse to beautify his capital. He was a voracious reader who carried a traveling library with him on his campaigns in a custom carriage. He read history and tragedy and would throw books out of the window if they bored him. He debated religion, philosophy with his savants in Egypt and questioned the nature of the soul. He was a pragmatist who used religion as a tool to bind the society together and maintain order. "I am a Muslim in Egypt and a Catholic in France," he once said, to explain his flexible faith. His relationship with his family was a constant source of frustration and disappointment to him. He showered his brothers and sisters with titles and kingdoms, but they were never satisfied. Joseph failed in Spain, and Louis failed in Holland, and Jerome was a playboy in Westphalia. Only his sister Pauline remained loyal to him to the end and offered to join him in exile. The tragedy of his son, the King of Rome, is one of the saddest chapters in the imperial saga. The boy was raised in the Austrian court as a German prince and taught to forget his father. He died young of tuberculosis, without ever knowing the man who had shaken the world for his sake. The legacy of Napoleon is also written in the blood of the common soldiers who followed him. The grognards, or grumblers, were the veterans of the old guard who would die rather than surrender. They wore their bearskin hats and long mustaches as badges of honor and intimidated the enemy by their mere presence. They marched thousands of miles across Europe in boots that fell apart and uniforms that turned to rags. They ate horsemeat in Russia and drank muddy water in Spain, and yet they shouted "Vive l'Empereur!" They did not fight for a flag or a country as much as they fought for the man who led them. He knew their names and pulled their ears in a gesture of familiarity that they cherished. He pinched their cheeks and asked about their villages and promised them pensions that the state could rarely pay. The bond between Napoleon and his army was a mystical connection that defied all logic and reason. It was this bond that allowed him to return from Elba and retake France without firing a shot. The scene at Grenoble where he walked alone towards the royalist troops is the stuff of legend. "Kill your emperor if you wish," he shouted and opened his gray coat to expose his chest. The soldiers dropped their muskets and wept and rushed forward to embrace him in a frenzy of joy. But the magic could not last forever against the united determination of the European powers. The Congress of Vienna was a gathering of vultures waiting to pick apart the carcass of the French Empire. Metternich of Austria and Castlereagh of Britain were the architects of the post-Napoleonic world order. They wanted to turn back the clock and pretend that the French Revolution had never happened. But the ideas that Napoleon had spread across Europe were like seeds that had already taken root. The Code Napoleon had introduced the concepts of civil marriage and divorce and religious toleration. The metric system which he championed brought a rational standard of measurement to the continent. The abolition of feudal privileges in the conquered lands gave the peasants a taste of freedom. The ghost of Napoleon haunted the 19th century and inspired revolutions in 1830 and 1848. His nephew, Napoleon III, tried to recreate the empire but ended in disaster and defeat. The legend of the great emperor eventually eclipsed the reality of the dictator and the conqueror. Historians argue over whether he was the last of the enlightened despots or the first of the modern totalitarian dictators. He created the first modern police state under Fouché with a network of spies and informants. He censored letters and newspapers and crushed any dissent with a ruthless efficiency. He reintroduced the slave trade in the Caribbean in a cynical attempt to restore the colonial economy. The Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture, was a stain on his record that can never be erased. He sent an army to crush the former slaves, and they perished from yellow fever and fierce resistance. It was his greatest failure in the colonial sphere and showed the limits of his power. The sale of Louisiana to the United States was a pragmatic decision to fund his wars in Europe. He gave up a vast empire in North America for a few $1,000,000 and the hope of creating a rival to Britain. The global impact of his decisions is still felt today in the borders of nations and the laws of states. He was a force of nature that swept away the cobwebs of the old world and forced it to modernize. He was a meritocrat who believed that talent should rise regardless of birth or social station. "Every soldier carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack" was the motto that drove his men. He was a workaholic who ruined his health with stress and bad food and a lack of sleep. He ate his meals in 10 minutes and often suffered from stomach cramps and nervous exhaustion. The image of the hand in the waistcoat was likely due to the chronic pain he felt in his abdomen. He grew fat and lethargic in his later years and lost the dynamic energy of his youth. The Napoleon of Waterloo was not the Napoleon of Austerlitz, and his enemies knew it. He hesitated when he should have acted, and he left the battlefield while the fighting still raged. The flight to Paris was a humiliating end to a career that had known only glory and adulation. The surrender to Captain Maitland on the HMS Bellerophon was the final act of the tragedy. He hoped for a quiet retirement in the English countryside, but the British government had other plans. They treated him as a prisoner of war and referred to him only as General Bonaparte to deny his imperial title. The indignity of St. Helena was a slow torture designed to break his spirit and silence his voice. The governor, Hudson Lowe, was a petty bureaucrat who delighted in enforcing petty restrictions. He limited the emperor's wine and censored his mail and reduced the number of his servants. Napoleon fought back with the only weapon he had left, which was his dignity and his wit. He turned his exile into a martyrdom that garnered sympathy from people all over the world. Even in Britain, there were those who admired the fallen giant and criticized the government's harshness. Lord Byron wrote poems about him, and the Whigs in Parliament used his treatment to attack the Tories. The death of Napoleon was the end of an era, but the beginning of a myth that would never die. The Invalides is not just a tomb, but a temple to the memory of French military glory. The names of his victories are carved into the stone of the Arc de Triomphe for eternity. The boulevards of Paris ring with the names of his marshals and his battles. The shadow of the little Corsican is long, and it falls across the pages of history with an undeniable weight. We study him not to worship him, but to understand the forces that shape our world. He showed us the heights of human ambition and the terrible price of unchecked power. He remains the benchmark against which all other generals and conquerors are measured. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is the story of the modern world in its painful birth. It is a story of blood and iron and gold and glory and the silence of the grave. It is the story of a man who tried to conquer the world and ended up conquering time. To understand the empire, one must understand the instruments of its power, beginning with the Imperial Guard. They were the immortals of the army who were never sacrificed unless the situation was desperate. They received better pay and better food and slept in beds while the line infantry slept in the mud. Their bearskin caps made them look like giants and struck terror into the hearts of the enemy. When the guard was committed to battle, the enemy knew that the emperor had played his final card. They were fiercely loyal to Napoleon, whom they called the Shaver because he shaved the enemy close. Next to them stood the marshals of the empire, who were the paladins of this new Charlemagne. Marshal Lannes was the Roland of the army, who led from the front and died in agony at Aspern-Essling. Napoleon wept by his bedside and held him as he took his last breath in a rare display of grief. Marshal Davout was the Iron Marshal who never lost a battle and was incorruptible and stern. At Auerstedt, he defeated a Prussian army 3 times the size of his own corps through sheer tactical brilliance. Marshal Massena was the dear child of victory, who loved money and women, but fought like a lion when cornered. Marshal Bernadotte was the envious rival who eventually turned against Napoleon and became the King of Sweden. These men were the pillars of the throne, but they were also the cracks that eventually brought it down. Their rivalries and jealousies often hampered operations in Spain and allowed Wellington to gain a foothold. The emperor tried to manage them all, but he could not be everywhere at once. The vastness of the empire meant that he had to rely on others who lacked his genius. The bureaucracy of the empire was a machine designed to funnel money and men into the war effort. The conscription was the blood tax that every village in France had to pay year after year. Mothers would weep when the lottery numbers were drawn and their sons were taken away to distant lands. Some young men cut off their thumbs or knocked out their front teeth to avoid the draft. But many others went willingly, dreaming of the baton in the knapsack and the cross of the Legion of Honor. The Legion of Honor was another stroke of genius that bound the nation to the emperor. It was a decoration open to all ranks and all classes, based solely on merit and bravery. The red ribbon became a symbol of the new France, where honor was earned and not inherited. Napoleon understood the psychology of men and knew that they would die for a colorful ribbon. He controlled the public opinion through the bulletins of the Grand Army, which were often full of lies. Lying like a bulletin became a common phrase in France to describe the propaganda of the regime. He exaggerated enemy losses and minimized his own to maintain morale on the home front. But behind the propaganda was a man who worked harder than any monarch in history. His secretaries would collapse from exhaustion while he continued to dictate letters in the bath. He had a compartmentalized mind and could switch from discussing the price of bread to the movement of corpses instantly. He was a micromanager who wanted to know how many pairs of shoes were in the depot at Strasbourg. This obsession with detail was his strength in the early years, but became a weakness as the empire grew. He could not control the movement of armies in Spain and Russia from a palace in Paris. The treason of Talleyrand and Fouché was a constant shadow that loomed over his reign. They saw that his ambition would ruin France and began to plot against him with foreign powers. Talleyrand called him a man of no breeding, while Fouché kept files on every secret in Paris. Napoleon knew they were betraying him, but he kept them close because he needed their skills. It was a fatal error to leave such dangerous men in positions of power while he was away. The social life of the empire was a glittering facade that hid the anxiety of constant war. The balls at the Tuileries were magnificent, but the men were often absent or wounded. The women of the court imitated the classical fashion with high waists and diaphanous white fabrics. Josephine was the queen of this society and set the trends that were followed across Europe. Her spending was legendary and drove Napoleon to fury, but he always paid her debts in the end. After the divorce, the court lost its charm and became stiff and formal under Marie-Louise. The Austrian princess was never popular with the French people, who saw her as a foreigner. The birth of the King of Rome was celebrated with cannon fire, but the dynasty was built on sand. The economic war with Britain was a stalemate that hurt the continent more than it hurt the islanders. The smugglers thrived along the coasts, and the people grumbled at the high price of coffee and sugar. The continental system was a strategic failure that turned allies into enemies and led to the Russian disaster. The invasion of Spain was the bleeding ulcer that drained the strength of the army for years. The guerrilla war was a new kind of horror where soldiers were tortured and murdered by civilians. The French responded with brutal reprisals that only fueled the hatred of the Spanish people. Goya painted the disasters of war and immortalized the cruelty of the conflict for all time. Napoleon underestimated the religious fervor of the Spanish and their loyalty to their Bourbon king. He thought he was bringing them liberty and progress, but they saw him as the Antichrist. It was his first great miscalculation, and it broke the myth of French invincibility. The nations of Europe took heart and began to reform their own armies to match the French. The Prussians adopted the staff system and the corps structure that Napoleon had perfected. The Austrians modernized their artillery and tactics to stand up to the Grand Army. By 1813, the gap in quality between the French and their enemies had largely closed. The French army of 1813 was young and inexperienced compared to the veterans of Austerlitz. The cavalry was weak because thousands of horses had died in the snows of Russia. Napoleon could no longer rely on sweeping maneuvers and had to fight bloody battles of attrition. The Battle of Leipzig was lost because the Saxons defected in the middle of the fight. It was a sign that the German people were rising up against the French domination. The War of Liberation had begun, and the poets of Germany called for a crusade against the tyrant. Napoleon was no longer the liberator of peoples, but the oppressor of nations. The wheel of fortune had turned, and the man of destiny was now the enemy of the world. Yet even in defeat, he showed a resilience that was superhuman. The campaign of France in 1814 was a tactical masterpiece fought against impossible odds. He darted between the invading armies and struck them with the speed of lightning. He won battle after battle at Champaubert and Montmirail and Vauchamp. For a moment, the Allies panicked and considered retreating back to the Rhine. But the weight of numbers was too great, and the marshals had lost the will to fight. The betrayal of Marmont, who surrendered Paris, was the final blow that forced the abdication. The farewell to the Old Guard at Fontainebleau was the most emotional scene of his life. He kissed the eagle of the standard and wept as the veterans cried, "Long live the Emperor!" They would have followed him to the ends of the earth, but he released them from their oath. He went to Elba not as a prisoner, but as a sovereign of a tiny realm. He played at being emperor, building roads and organizing a miniature army and navy. But his eye was always on France, and he waited for the Bourbons to make a mistake. The return of the violet in the spring of 1815 was the last gamble of a desperate player. The 100 Days was a dream that was doomed to end in a nightmare. The Battle of Waterloo was a close-run thing, as Wellington himself admitted. If Grouchy had marched to the sound of the guns, the history of the world might have been different. If the ground had been dry, the French artillery might have crushed the British squares. If Ney had not charged the cavalry prematurely, the infantry might have broken the line. The what-ifs of Waterloo have fascinated historians and soldiers for 2 centuries. But the verdict of history was delivered on that muddy field in Belgium. The era of the sword was over, and the era of the diplomat had returned. The Congress of Vienna restored the old boundaries and the old kings to their thrones. But they could not restore the old spirit of submission in the hearts of the people. The genie of liberty was out of the bottle and could not be put back in. The revolutions of the 19th century were the aftershocks of the Napoleonic earthquake. The unification of Italy was led by men who had served in the French administration. The rise of Germany was a reaction to the humiliation of the French conquest. The Code Napoleon is still the law of the land in Louisiana and Quebec, and much of Europe. The metric system is used by scientists and engineers all over the globe. The art of war is still taught in the academies, using his campaigns as the primary text. The concept of total war, where the entire nation is mobilized, began with him. He was the first modern man who shaped his own image and destiny through the media. He was a propaganda genius who knew how to speak to the soul of the masses. He remains a controversial figure, loved by some as a hero and hated by others as a monster. But no one can deny the sheer magnitude of his impact on the human story. He was a meteor that burned brightly across the sky and changed the landscape forever. The silence of St. Helena was the final curtain on the greatest drama of the age.